I found a disturbing tape that my wife and her ex-husband filmed on their wedding night. My name's Jose, and I, 49M, have been married to Kelly, 42F, for 6 years. We met at Mexico City International Airport in 2014. Both of us were waiting in a bar for a late-night long haul to London. She quickly clocked my black epaulets, each bearing 4 yellow stripes, then swiveled in her bar stool to smile at me. It was an unconvincing smile. I remember that. She looked like she'd been crying. And I also remember her asking, "Are you flying somewhere far, far away?" When I revealed my destination, this pretty stranger laughed and said that she would be on my flight. I don't remember much of what I said, truth be told, but I quipped about her not needing to worry because I'd just read Flying for Dummies. I know. I'm not the first captain to make that joke. In all honesty, as scummy as it seems, I wanted to impress this heartbroken wife. She captivated me. After all of these years, I still remember every last thing she said. On the other hand, my words and feelings are fuzzy memories. Have been from the get-go. My mother used to say Kelly had put a spell on me. Anyway, without being prompted, the sullen woman told me her story. That she was enjoying a honeymoon in Mexico, but she'd booked an early return flight home. Kelly explained that her husband, Michael, wasn't the person he purported to be. He was an abuser. A liar. And he's making me tell lies too, she said. He emptied me. That bizarre and unsettling choice of words would ring in my head for the next 10 years. And only one day ago, after I found and watched that cursed tape, did I finally understand what Kelly meant. I think, at that airport bar a decade ago, she might have been warning me to stay away from her. I think that had been a glimpse of the real Kelly. But I'm not making sense. Let me explain. It could have ended at the end of that conversation. We could have parted ways. I wish we had. But I was compelled to see Kelly again. I know that's awful. It's not a habit of mine, falling for a married woman. I just felt something indescribable. Something I now realize may not have been love at all. I spent a week in London before the return flight to Mexico, so I frequently met up with Kelly at her hotel to check that she was okay. She was too frightened to return to her hometown in Cambridge, as she believed that Michael would find her. Kelly ignored my pleas to report everything to the police, which seemed strange even at the time. To cut a long story short, we quickly formed a bond, and things didn't end when I returned to Mexico. I visited Kelly every time I flew to England. She moved to Brighton, so I took the train to see her, depending on where I landed. I once took a short-haul flight from Paris to London just to see her. A year later, when our relationship inevitably became something more, I'd already made the decision. I wanted to move to England to be with her. I'd been training to become an airport technician, and I secured a job at Heathrow in late 2015. By early 2017, Kelly and I had bought a house together. In 2018, we got married. I'm obviously fast-forwarding through the ins and outs of our relationship, but Reddit isn't built for essays, is it? I'm here to tell you what I found yesterday morning whilst tidying a storage cupboard. Kelly's clusterfuck of clutter, as I like to call it, came tumbling out of the open door and washed over my feet. A stark reminder that weekends shouldn't be wasted on chores. If I'd been relaxing on the sofa, I might not have discovered what I discovered. Maybe Kelly would have disposed of her own clutter, and we would have lived a happy 50 years together. But I was the one wading through the puddle of forgotten belongings. And what caught my eye during the tumble was a camcorder, surfing atop the junk heap, which spilled out of its bag. Landed at my feet. I picked it up and chuckled. I knew Kelly and I were old, but not that old. I had no idea she owned such a relic. And curiosity got the better of me, obviously. Who wouldn't want to check the contents of a spouse's dusty tape locked away for who knows how many decades? When I plugged in the device to charge it, an error message displayed on the ancient screen. I thought I'd been thwarted by tape or hardware degradation. But I fixed everything, unfortunately, by cleaning out filth from the tape slot. Then I rewound the recording and pressed the play icon. The white, pixelated text read, October 9th, 2014. For Americans, that's September 10th, 2014. And I quickly realized that was a week before I first met my wife. Everything slotted together horribly when Kelly stepped out of a hotel bathroom in wedding lingerie. I realized what kind of tape I'd found. Don't think less of me for watching. It wasn't like that. Even degenerates, I assume, don't want to watch the person they love share such intimacy with someone else, let alone an abusive ex-husband. And Michael was abusive. Kelly wasn't lying about that. But she'd only ever told me fragments of the story. So, even though I expected a raunchy sex tape, I wasn't watching for that reason. My eyeballs weren't springing from their cartoon sockets. Well, okay, I was watching the video keenly, but fear rendered me wide-eyed. Not lust. I just knew that something was wrong with the hotel room. The only natural thing in the footage was Kelly. And as I watched my wife sprawl across the bedsheets, waiting for her filming husband to join her, I eyed the room's cream-colored walls. I didn't give a rat's rear about the interior design, but something hidden in the paint made me sick. You wouldn't understand unless you'd seen the video for yourself. Then something in my head started to ache sharply, much like a migraine brewing behind my sockets. But it wasn't that. It was a painful urge which prompted each of my squeaking eyes to twist. I looked, without even wanting to look, at the edge of the screen. Searched for something that was only just beyond both the border of the video and Kelly's vision. I wanted to scream at the younger version of my wife as she lay still. As she watched Michael with caving dimples and a provocative grin. I wanted to scream at her to run, though I didn't know why I wanted to do so. That was the most terrifying thing of all. I didn't fear the obvious horror of watching my wife and her ex make love. I feared something else in the room. Something I didn't understand. Get rid of that camera, Kelly whispered, before wagging her index in a come-hither motion. Michael's heavy breathing was not the breathing of a lustful man. It was the labored breathing of something hungry. Hungry in a way that neither food nor sex could satiate. We need to preserve this moment, Michael said. Kelly rolled her eyes. Is that right? In response, the man stopped breathing, and my wife's face changed. Her sultry smile morphed into not a frown, but downturned lips. Lips hanging open in the same horrified expression that I must have been wearing whilst watching the tape. Michael hacked, as if bringing up a hairball, then promised, I'll put it down. He placed the device on the dressing table and walked over to the bed, but Kelly did not thank him. She whimpered and recoiled. Not due to Michael leading the camera recording, I don't even think she'd noticed its red, blinking light. No, my wife was still frightened because she sensed a presence. Not her husband. Not the room's seedy atmosphere. Not even the claustrophobic nature of the walls. She sensed the same thing that I sensed, though neither of us knew exactly what we sensed. I'm not in the mood anymore, Kelly whimpered as Michael climbed onto the bed. He hushed her, stroking the backs of his twitching fingers against her trembling cheek. Don't be like that, darling. It's time to consummate. Then Michael gasped like a punctured tire and shot his head towards the empty corner of the room. He nodded slowly, but neither I nor the recorded version of Kelly saw what he saw. If I must, he told the empty air. Then came something I still don't know how to explain. The plaster rippled as something behind the wall pressed against it. Tried to get out. Like a hand forming a shadow puppet, something about the shape was illusory. It could have been a man. Could have been a monster. Its outline rapidly changed from a tall thing with arms and legs to a misshapen blob of indiscernible segments. After less than a second or two of the wall bulging, its plaster flattened again, and the living shape was gone. Kelly screamed in synchronicity with me, but she hadn't even noticed the anomaly. She was staring, unblinkingly, into her husband's eyes. "What's wrong with your face, Michael?" she cried. What terrified me was that, even when the camera caught his face, I didn't see any supernatural change in Kelly's former husband. Didn't see anything other than a very human man, one with an unkind smile and dead eyes, perhaps, but still a man. However, Kelly saw something. Something I didn't. Still, all of that pales in comparison to what happened next. Michael thrust his hand into Kelly's open mouth, prompting her eyes to open just as widely. Her husband's whole forearm plunged into her jaws, muffling her series of screams. Then my wife wriggled and squirmed as Michael propelled his upper arm down her throat. Pushed deeper and deeper until his shoulder met her lips. Another impossibility followed. One that I still don't know how to put into words. Michael pulled his arm out of Kelly's mouth, and when his fingers resurfaced, they were holding something. Not my wife's innards, not the innards I had expected, at least. There wasn't a speck of blood on the man's hand, but a wet, translucent film. It looked a little like either saliva or lubricant. But, again, that wasn't what horrified me. Michael's fingers were clutching the hair of a human head. A head sitting at the top of Kelly's throat, like some wretched birthing canal. My wife's lips opened unimaginably wide, as did mine. I gawped in incomprehensible horror. She gawped simply to make room for that adult head to emerge. Then gawped wider to free a set of shoulders and a torso. I uttered an entirely silent scream, believing that, if I were to produce even the tiniest sound, something from within that footage would hear me in the future. But a slight whimper escaped once I'd identified the head. It was Kelly. A clone version of Kelly was climbing out of her lips. Some fleshy Russian doll. That younger version of my wife was birthing an exact replica of herself. And the clone was screaming too, for it didn't ask to be born. The original Kelly's skin started to crinkle, crease, and shrivel into something smaller. The clone undressed. Shed her former skin. Reduced the original Kelly to a silky dress that dropped onto the duvet. Then the clone, the new Kelly, fell into Michael's arms, and she eyed the empty skin suit beside her. She may have been screaming through those open lips, but a white sound was drowning all other noises. A prickly static that dug into my flesh. That maddening racket was accompanied by a gangly shadow moving across the wall of the hotel room's entryway. A shadow with the vague appearance of a man. But the tape cut out before the stranger came into view. Hard on my tongue, I hurriedly thrust the camera back into the bag and tossed it against the back wall of the cupboard. And mere moments later, there came the sound of my wife's car pulling into the driveway, so I tried to compose myself. Tried to forget the hellishness I had just seen on her old wedding tape. I looked out of the window at the driveway, but she wasn't in her car. And when I turned back to the kitchen doorway, I screamed. There Kelly stood, hounding me with blank eyes and tight lips. With a face horribly white, yet no whiter than usual. I realized I was simply seeing her true self. It had only taken me 10 years to open my eyes. "How did you come indoors so quietly?" I tried to ask, though nothing but a series of hoarse whispers sounded. "Jose," Kelly began, before lifting the camera bag she'd inexplicably acquired. "We were meant to be decluttering, darling. Why would you want to hold on to this?" I tried to answer, but I was startled by my wife's sudden step towards me. A solitary step, followed by a gasp and a jolt, much like her ex-husband in the video. Then Kelly looked towards an unoccupied corner of the kitchen and said, "If I must." Upon hearing that echo of Michael's haunting words, I ran. Barged past my wife, who seemed either unprepared or unbothered by my escape. I ran out of the house, leapt into my car, and drove. Drove away from my life. I've been on the road for more than a day, stealing bursts of sleep in service station car parks. It's currently 2 in the morning, and I was just woken by the sound of white noise. Not from a playing videotape, but from the world around me. That static drowned everything for one horrendous minute. I didn't want to look out of my driver's window, but there also came that familiar strain behind my eyes. A coded warning from my brain. And when I sat up to look outside, I locked eyes with a large truck parked a couple of spaces to my right. That was when I yelled until my vocal cords gave out. The side of the vehicle rippled in much the same way as the wall of the hotel room. Rippled to form the outline of a man inside the storage compartment. He was pressing against the truck's side, trying to push through the metal. The shape quickly lost its definition, then it became nothing at all. All that remained was an abandoned truck and a near-deserted car park. I don't know what to do. Please help me before that thing finds me. Before it pulls something out of me. I threw out my son's teddy bear and now he's different. About a month ago, my 5-year-old son Luke became obsessed with an old teddy bear. It was falling apart, one eye missing, stuffing leaking out, but he refused to let it go. He called it Mr. Bear, though he never named it before. My wife and I decided to throw it away while Luke slept. The next morning, he woke up frantic. "Where's Mr. Bear?" he screamed, terrified. It wasn't just a normal tantrum. Luke was pale, shaking, like something terrible had happened. He kept saying, "I have to find him. He'll be mad at me." That night, things escalated. Luke didn't sleep. He started whispering to someone, pointing at the closet, saying, "He's here." I found him wide-eyed and sweating, clutching the bear's old ribbon. I know I threw that bear away, but the ribbon was back, dirty and frayed, wrapped tight around his little hands. I tried to take it, but Luke screamed, "Don't! He's watching!" Later that night, I woke up to scratching. I thought it was the wind, but the sound was coming from under my bed. I leaned over, heart pounding, and saw a hand, long, pale fingers with jagged nails, reaching out from beneath the bed. Before I could move, it grabbed my ankle, ice cold and sharp. I'd never felt anything so cold in my life, at least not anything living. I yanked free, pulling Luke into my arms. Clutching each other's hands, we ran for the door, but as we reached it, something slammed against it from the other side, hard. The door rattled, deep breathing echoed through the room, and claws scraped against the wood. There was something so intense about the scratching, like whatever was doing it would stop at nothing until it broke through. I turned to Luke, but he wasn't scared anymore. His face was blank. "You shouldn't have thrown him away," he whispered. The scratching stopped. I finally opened the door, pulling Luke out of the room. We stayed in the living room that night. I didn't sleep. The house was quiet, but I could still feel it, him, watching. The next morning, Luke was different. He just sat in his room, holding the bear's ribbon. His voice was barely a whisper. "I'm sorry. I'll bring him back." And then I noticed it, dark, wet dirt, scattered across the floor, leading from the bed to the closet. Luke looked up at me, his eyes dark, hollow. He squeezed the ribbon tightly in his fist. "You can't stop him," he said, his voice cold. "Mr. Bear's coming for you." I'm writing this from my study. The house is quiet now, too quiet. Luke hasn't made a sound in hours, and I'm too scared to check on him. The ribbon, dirt, the hand. I can still feel the cold grip on my ankle. I've locked myself in here, hoping it'll be enough, but deep down, I know it won't be. The scratching has started again, faint at first, but it's growing louder. I hear it coming from under the door, and I know what's next. There's no escape. I threw him away, and now he's coming for me. I'm worried that my hometown doesn't exist. I was born in Sunset Bay, Florida, or at least I thought I was born there. I thought I was raised there, spent 17.5 years of my life there, went to school there, had my first kiss there, and almost lost my virginity there, but now I can't even be sure. You see, as far as the world seems to be concerned, there is no such place as Sunset Bay, Florida, and there never was. Unfortunately, this story began with Hurricane Milton. As we're all well aware by now, Milton was utterly devastating for many fellow Floridians this month, and let me just say that my heart goes out to them all, well and truly. Luckily for me, though, I'd moved out of Florida with my family in 1995, just a few months before I turned 18, and I now reside in British Columbia, here in Canada. Understandably, though, when I heard that Milton made landfall in Florida, I was concerned for my hometown. I'd never been incredibly attached to Sunset Bay, and frankly, it had been years since I'd even thought of the place. I have 2 sons and a wife, so there are more important things in my life than reminiscing about my formative years down south. However, when I learned Milton had made a pass around near Big Cypress down by Ocho-Pee, that got my blood pumping something fierce. You see, Sunset Bay is, or was, or maybe never was, only a handful of miles away. Naturally, I hopped on my computer when I got the chance and did some searching. I looked up Hurricane Milton Sunset Bay. At first, I was relieved to find I'd come up with 0 results. I figured that meant there hadn't been anything newsworthy there, which could have been good news in and of itself. But I was soon struck by the realization that I wasn't seeing any news about Sunset Bay because the search engine had taken the liberty of assuming I was asking about Sunset Beach down on Treasure Island. So I tried rephrasing Hurricane Milton Sunset Bay, Florida, Ocho-Pee, but nothing. All I got was a handful of irrelevant pages on Sunset Beach, Siesta Key, and even Tampa. I was hit each time with a prompt asking me something like, "Did you mean Hurricane Milton Sunset Beach?" I found myself, like a real old man, sitting there while verbally beginning to chew out the computer. No, I would say, and no, not Sunset Beach, Sunset Bay. I found myself getting so fed up with what I took to be some sort of Abbott and Costello-style mix-up that I ended up trying to soothe my seething self by simply typing in Sunset Bay with the hope that it'd get me somewhere, but to my shock and severe annoyance, I found myself yet again redirected to Sunset Beach. For context, Sunset Beach is a whole 5 or so hours from where Sunset Bay should be. They are not the same place in any sense of the word. I found myself seething even further, typing in Sunset Bay into my search bar with every sort of permutation I could think of. Sunset Bay, Florida, Sunset Bay, Florida, Florida Sunset Bay, United States, Sunset Bay, Ocho-Pee, Florida, United States, but never got a single result. By then, I was livid, but I was also determined to beat the computer, as dumb as that sounds, to get the results I was looking for. Call me stupid, call me stubborn, call the endeavor pointless, I simply wanted it to work, once. But it never worked, not even once. Not even a hint of acknowledgement that Sunset Bay ever existed. Not even Google Maps would acknowledge its existence. Believe me, I tried. Eventually, it got to the point where I figured that the only way to get this damn thing working would be to stop looking up Sunset Bay itself and instead look up some specific place in Sunset Bay that may have some sort of website, maybe online reviews, maybe a blog post, something, anything. So I took a pause, rolled back from the desk, furrowed my brow, and got to thinking. I tried to think of where the most significant, internet-worthy place from back home might be, but the moment the neurons began firing off in my mind, I was struck with a pain so intense I can hardly even describe it. I'd imagine it felt like how it would feel if your skull was cleaved apart with an axe and then boiling pitch was poured into the gaping wound. I screamed my lungs out, grabbed my head with both hands and came careening down onto the floor, gasping and panting like a drowning man. The world felt like it was going out of focus, but, my ear on the ground, I could hear the dull footsteps of my eldest son running into the room, followed shortly by my wife, as they hoisted me onto my feet as best they could. They asked me what was wrong, and why I had shouted, and I could only respond by telling them it was probably nothing, just a bad headache. Even so, my wife, who has some sort of sick addiction to these medical channels on YouTube, made me promise to see a doctor because she told me there was something called thunderclap headaches and they could be a sign of something really dangerous. Before you ask, no, I haven't gone yet, but I'm booked in for next week with my GP. To my relief, it seemed as though as soon as the subject was changed and my mind drifted back from the vague memories of my hometown, I felt good as new again, as though nothing had even happened. I gave my family reassurances as best as I could, gave my wife a quick kiss and my son a hug, and placed myself firmly back down in my chair. I was back in the saddle, and I hadn't been bested yet. Piece of shit, I murmured as I slapped the keyboard, looking up to see my wife, hand outstretched with some Tylenol for me, to whom I quickly clarified that the computer was the piece of shit, not her. She gave me a quick, understanding chuckle, and left, leaving me alone once again with my new arch-nemesis, the computer. However, it only took me a few more failed searches to get utterly fed up, and to hell with it, later I was storming out of the room, throwing in the metaphorical towel. I had better things to do with my time. Or so I thought. Because, that night, as I lay in bed, I found myself grumbling, huffing and puffing to myself like a candy-deprived child about the whole debacle. However, the more I ran over the whole situation in my mind, the more my frustration began to morph into unease, and the more thoughts like why the hell couldn't I find anything about Sunset Bay, to why couldn't I find anything about Sunset Bay? Surely it's an abnormal occurrence for a town with a public school, thousands of residents, and several notable businesses to simply disappear not just from the map, but from the veritable neo-library of Alexandria that is the internet, right? I couldn't take it anymore. My annoyance had morphed into an overwhelming sense of dread, and I found myself in desperate need of some assurance that this was all some huge mistake. So I went digging not through the computer this time, but through an old wicker cabinet by the edge of the bed full of keepsakes and mementos. After a few moments of searching I found what I was looking for, my middle school yearbook from Sunset Bay Public School, an incredibly creative name, trust me, I know. To not wake my wife, I slipped away with the book back into my office, cracked it open across the desk like some sort of ancient scroll, and found my dread quickly turning to terror. There I was, my page was bookmarked, and to my right should have been Brock Tanner, but I found my greasy, pimple-pocked face next to a pale, gray square, and below, where the name should have been, was an amorphous black smudge like the ink had been nearly rubbed out with a cloth. A misprint, maybe? I thought so, but I became less and less certain the more laminated pages I turned, finding myself faced with an ocean of gray squares and black smudges swirling into a blobby mess like a horrifying Rorschach test, occasionally broken up by a calm, unbothered young face on whom the horror of this whole ordeal was understandably lost. Eyes glued to the page, I found myself fumbling for the landline, dialing the school's phone number as if from muscle memory from all those days playing hooky as a kid. It never even crossed my mind that even if this was all some huge misunderstanding, they'd certainly be closed in the dead of night. But the phone rang. It rang, and then it rang again, but a little softer, and softer still. The quivering sounds of the line grew faint and distant, quieter still, as though the phone were being dropped down a bottomless pit, falling away until it was entirely indistinct. I nearly screamed in surprise when, breaking up the dead silence, a robotic voice boomed, crackling and monotone, telling me the call was unable to be completed as dialed, before booting me out, leaving me right back where I started, eyes wild, panting in distress, fists clenched on the arms of my chair. Mackenzie, I stammered to myself, in a fervor now, glancing down at the face of Mackenzie Connors, one of the few remaining human buoys in the ocean of nothingness which glared back at me from the page. I went right to the computer, booted it up, and typed in Mackenzie Connors, Sunset Bay, Florida, and to my surprise and delighted relief I was able to find what seemed to be her LinkedIn page, which, while having no visible mention of Sunset Bay, did mention that she was from Florida, and she looked to be about the right build and age to be her. Once again, I failed to consider that it was the middle of the night, and may very well be wherever Mackenzie was now, but I needed this. I needed to hear someone's voice, someone from back home. I didn't even have an excuse for calling. The best I could think of was maybe something about the oddity of the yearbook, but the line connected before I could think of anything better. Hudson Tech Solutions, Mackenzie speaking, how may I help you? Hey, Mackenzie? I asked, the awkwardness of this whole situation beginning to dawn on me. Yes? How may I help you, sir? I apologize if I've got the wrong person here, but did you happen to go to school in Sunset Bay, Florida? Excuse me? I heard her begin before my ears were utterly assaulted by a horrifying, high-pitched scream from the phone speaker, so shrill and intense I worried it would tear the thing to bits, along with the grating sound of shattering glass. Mackenzie? I tried to remain calm, my head beginning to throb through the dullness of the painkillers. Mackenzie, are you okay? No reply. I sat wide-eyed in horror as the line seemed to briefly go dead before I could hear the sound of quiet, murmuring voices and approaching footsteps as I assumed people began to barge into her room. Hey, Mackenzie, are you all right? One voice asked. Did someone scream? Another timidly inquired. Shit, she's on the ground, she's on the ground. A woman shrieked. Let go of the phone, let go of the another implored feverishly before the line went dead, leaving me in stunned silence with the dial tone buzzing in my ear. I was mortified. I couldn't do anything but set the phone down on the table, not even the receiver, and shuffle, milky-eyed, back to the bedroom, whereupon I slid under the covers and shuffled up to my wife, as though by wrapping my arms around her I was trying to confirm to myself that I did exist and things did make sense. I wish I had more to tell you, but as of now, this is where I'm at. I sincerely hope someone can help me here, because I have not, for the life of me, been able to find any external references to my hometown, and every time I try and think real hard about it, it feels like my head is going to implode, or explode, or shatter into a million pieces. Can someone please help me? Beware of the booger goblin. Are you sure you're okay trick-or-treating alone tonight? I could hear the concern in Mom's voice, but I wasn't sure it was real. She had to work late every night this week, and I knew she didn't have an answer if I said no. Mom, no, I mean, yes, I'm fine with trick-or-treating by myself. I'm 12. This is probably the last year I can even do it. A moment of quiet on the line and then, but it's only Monday night, right? Maybe if you do it later in the week I could get off early enough to drive you around. Another pause. Or do you think some of the neighborhood kids would let you go with them? I felt resentment starting to stir in my chest. I already gave her what she wanted, why is she dragging this out? I thought about just agreeing to wait for her to take me out of spite, but it would just end up with me going on Halloween by myself anyway. No, none of the kids around here are my friends and most are way young. I'll be fine. This is the night the town picked for trick-or-treating, which is dumb, but if I don't go tonight I'm afraid a lot of the houses won't have candy. I'll be fine. Another pause. Okay. If you're sure. Yeah, I'm sure. I need to go. It's getting dark. Laying under a pile of dead leaves 2 hours later, I thought back to that phone call. How I should have waited. Or if I went tonight, I should have stuck to just the roads I knew well. Instead, I got irritated that some of the houses had already given out of candy before I got to them. And instead of facing the idea of going home to an empty house, I decided to keep pushing on, riding my bike out to the state road and then down a side street that trailed off into another couple of neighborhoods before leading to a narrow paved path that could have been a small road or a giant driveway. Either way, I figured there had to be more houses up there for it to be paved so well, and I had started getting better candy the farther out I went. I was still debating when I saw a killer clown coming toward me with his mother. They didn't look at me as they walked closer, so I called out to them instead. Hey, do they have good candy up there? The woman turned and stared at me, letting out a big belch as she nodded. Yeah. Good stuff up there. She gave me a weird smile and then kept walking past without another word. I don't think her little clown ever said a word. I frowned after them a moment before giving a shrug. People were weird, but what did it matter? Turning my bike onto the road, I started heading up into the trees. It was much darker here, at least in patches, but periodically there would be a solar light dotting one side of the road or the other. I felt myself getting a bit more excited. This must be a giant driveway, which meant the house must be big and rich. As I went up further, most of the lights started having Halloween decorations around them, fancy stuff like you see on television. It was cool, but it was also weird. The trees were so thick and dark, and the lights were spaced out enough that it seemed like I was riding out to the middle of nowhere, but then I'd ride past this awesome zombie waving his arms from the ground next to one of the lights. You would think that the sign wouldn't have caught my attention more than the rest, but it did. Not because it was fancy, but because it wasn't. Just a wooden sign made out of particle board and propped up on what looked like the original decorations for that light, an evil-looking pumpkin that looked like it had a twisted grin, but that you couldn't really see for the sheet of wood propped against it to catch the nearest solar light. And across the front of the particle board were 4 spray-painted red words. Beware the Booger Goblin. I had actually stopped and laughed a little at that sign. It looked like whoever lived up here had a kid that decided to fuck up one of their bougie decorations for something that looked like it belonged at a flea market or sketchy fair. Booger Goblin. How dumb was. I jumped as I heard a strange whistle from one of the trees above me. It was musical, but it didn't sound like a bird. Heart pounding, I looked around for where it would have come from. A speaker maybe? Something to spook people when they got close to the house? I heard another whistle from the other side of the road. Lower to the ground and closer than before. I had the thought that it was a deeper sound, like something else talking back to the first. Fuck that. I started pedaling again, harder now than I had all night. I considered turning around and going back down, but I was so scared that the idea of taking the time to turn and head back down that long stretch of dark driveway seemed worse than just going on, especially when I had to be getting close to the house. Sure enough, as I rounded the next corner I saw the house. It was even bigger than I'd expected, with orange lights and decorations covering most of its 3 floors. There were more decorations in the yard, but I just kept to the driveway as I searched the doors and windows of the house for some sign of life or help. Maybe it was all just part of the Halloween stuff these people had going, but it didn't feel like a trick or a decoration. And that little girl in the window, up on the 2nd floor there was a dark-haired girl in the window, beating on the glass and waving at me, waving me away. She wasn't fake. She was crying and screaming and I could almost make out what. That's when the Booger Goblin jumped onto me. I fell off the bike immediately, screaming and clawing at it as it crawled from my back up to the top of my head. It had hard claws that dug in as I reached up to it, screaming louder as I felt the hard, slick surface of plates of bug skin. It felt like a roly-poly looked, or a centipede. But it was smaller, rounder and fatter, and as I tried to rake it off, it just dug in tighter as 2 fingers or tentacles drifted past my eyes before curving and going up my nose deeply. Everything went red and my brain felt like it was on fire. But that only lasted a couple of seconds before it all turned cold and numb as it started squirting something into my head. I felt my body slowing down, calming. I still wanted to fight, to run, to get it off and out of me, but I couldn't anymore. I wasn't screaming either, and for a minute or two I just lay very still as that numb feeling took over. Then my hand started pulling me along the ground, away from the house and driveway and into a large pile of dead leaves a few feet away. My body pulled itself into that pile before going still, and using the last of my strength I managed to turn my head so I could still see out of the leaves, trying to get out a call for help from whoever might be out there. But no, I couldn't make a sound. Just scream in my head as everything went very still except for the soft, squelching noise of more wetness being pushed into me. A few minutes passed like that before I saw someone new. It was a group of 5 kids, most of them a year or 2 younger than me, coming up the driveway together. They didn't seem terrified or like they'd been attacked. Maybe the Booger Goblins only attacked people when they were alone. I thought about the mother and son I'd seen on the way up, or in pairs. Either way, it didn't matter. These kids were just laughing and joking and having a good time, and while a couple of them glanced at my bike and candy bag in the yard, I could tell none of them could see me in the leaves. I tried again to move or make a noise, but there was no point. I could have been watching a video of all this for how not in control I was now. My only hope was that the kids would notice something was weird with the house. Maybe the little girl or something. A pale, blonde girl with devil horns and a jack-o'-lantern candy pail led the way up the porch and rang the doorbell. I wasn't sure anyone would even answer, but within a few seconds a man opened the door. I couldn't see him from my angle, but I could hear his deep voice, strange and detached, as he told them Happy Halloween before letting out a wet belch. The kids didn't say anything other than thank you as they got their candy, but I could tell they were creeped out as they left. They walked faster, and there were no jokes or laughter anymore. Still, it wouldn't be enough. They didn't know anything was wrong, and if nothing got them on the way out, they'd probably go home thinking they had a cool, creepy experience close to Halloween. And I could feel myself being pushed farther and farther down some weird hallway in myself. I could still see and hear, but I couldn't feel anything at all now, and when the goblin finally pulled its fingers out of my nose and left across the yard, I only knew because I saw its speckled belly as it crawled across my face. A few more minutes passed, I think. Then I was moving again, crawling out of the leaves and sitting up with a loud burp. My head and eyes moved up to the figure standing above me. The man from the door, maybe. He watched silently as my body stood up, and then handed me back my bag of candy as he wiped at his mouth with the back of his other hand. Happy Halloween. My friends and I found the secret sidewalk. Hollywood loves remakes. That's because Hollywood itself is a remake. Close your eyes and imagine a silent film. I bet you're seeing Charlie Chaplin in all of his black and white greatness, but what you might not realize is this movie you're picturing doesn't take place in Los Angeles. It's actually 350 miles north in Niles Canyon. America's first Hollywood. Niles is nestled between the base of sprawling foothills and sits at the outside edge of the San Francisco Bay's marine layer. It's a quaint, little neighborhood. One that remained frozen in the era of its former glory. A classic Americana main street serves as an anchor to craftsman and Victorian-style homes. At the end of Niles Boulevard is the Silent Film Museum honoring the area's historic past life. And in the hillside that overlooks the retired train station, you'll see big white letters reading Niles, in the same style Hollywood made iconic. Niles has always been connected with something darker, though. For how small the area is, there has been a surprisingly high amount of death. Mostly due to the winding one-way lane roads that run through the steep hills. Naturally, this has spawned a lot of urban legends. Like the one about a girl who walks the canyon road at night asking for a ride back home to San Francisco, only to disappear before getting there. Or the tales about the White Witch in the woods, and the stories about mysterious societies that meet under midnight's obscurity. Hell, there's even sightings of Charlie Chaplin's ghost. This is my personal favorite because witnesses always claim to see him in grayscale and moving at 16 frames per second. I think every town that is old enough has this kind of lore. Where I figure Niles is a bit different, though, is that it is home to the secret sidewalk. Deep in the foothills is what is known as the secret sidewalk. A long and mysterious stretch of cement that slithers through the hills for miles. It's hard to get to and is one of those kind of places that's passed down from one generation of young people to the next. A place that you hear your friend's older brother bragging about for years before they get too old for it and finally shows you how to get to it. Some of my favorite memories were the days my friends and I would ditch 6th period, fill a backpack with beer, and spend all day wandering the sidewalk. What the quote-unquote sidewalk actually is an aqueduct that used to carry water from the bay to local reservoirs. Long dried up and out of service, it now rests covered in graffiti with multiple openings pried ajar, turning the square cement structure into hollow tunnels for urban explorers or anyone brave enough to go in. I can't lie, there actually is a pretty weird feeling when you walk the sidewalk. An adrenaline boost. I don't know if it's the fact that you're legally not supposed to be there, or the suspended train track bridge you have to cross to get to it, or the silent absence of everyday bustle, but the feeling of vulnerability is palpable and hangs in the air. If you go at the right time of year, fog spills down the hill crevices like fingers reaching out for the lower canyon, adding to the eeriness of it. Earlier I said that it's what is known as the secret sidewalk. That's because it's not the real one. I know this because my friends and I regrettably found the real one a few years ago. The guys and I were far removed from our teenage youth, and to be honest, at this point, we were too old to still be going there, but we were all together and feeling nostalgic. So, we decided to go. We were about an hour or so into the hike and disappointingly, nothing too memorable was happening. The sidewalk was still there, as it always was, but now it was without our names adorning the sides of it in bright, obnoxiously bad, spray-painted fonts. Our names, now entombed under the brighter, more obnoxiously bad, spray-painted fonts of Generation Alpha and Z before them. The initial rush of adrenaline had worn off, and I forget who finally said it, but we all agreed to call it and head back. I think it was less boredom and more so that we felt a little embarrassed at how immature it all was. I mean, we were closer in age to being the people who say, "Aren't you a little old to be trick or treating?" than the people who were a little old to be trick or treating. So, in a collective moment of clarity, we realized that we shouldn't have been doing what we were doing. My friend had to piss before we left, which didn't help our immaturity-rooted insecurities, but he went off to the side to handle his business regardless. We had explored the secret sidewalk at least 100 times and felt pretty comfortable knowing our way around. I say this because my friend came back and said he saw something that he had never seen there before. Being the aforementioned stupid men that we were, we couldn't resist checking it out. Through the shrubbery, you could see what looked like a sidewalk on the other side. A real sidewalk, not an aqueduct. Overgrown and beaten, sure, but there was definitely cobble-looking stones joined together forming a walkway. We joked and named it the super-duper secret sidewalk. We decided that we didn't invest years of our life exploring here to not see where it led to. We pushed the branches aside and started to walk it. Walking on this man-made structure in the middle of the wilderness felt unnatural, but the fact that it wasn't destroyed by asshole kids made it feel unexplored by anyone else. That excited us. We all were kind of giddy at the thought of actually discovering something. Usually, all you found out there was crushed Natty Ice cans and the occasional unwrapped condom. This was best case scenario to us because it was new, and also not an unwrapped condom. Every now and then we'd actually see signs that we weren't the first to walk this path. An occasional sweater, or a beanie, and even a single shoe could be found laying off to the side of the sidewalk. At first, I weirdly found comfort in the discarded clothes. It made me feel less alone that someone had done this before, if that makes sense. Like, trail markers reminding you that what's ahead has been formerly walked. But the further we got, the more that feeling changed. I didn't clock it at first because of how smooth down they were, but what I originally thought was cobblestone didn't actually seem to be. It was subtle, but every now and then I'd catch it. Etched in stone were letters and numbers. They were hard to see because the stones were laid out in mosaic fashion. If you just looked at one piece, you could assume they were just scratches, but when you looked at multiple, it became clearer. We were walking on a path made of shattered headstones. At this point, I noticed that we were growing increasingly irritable. At first, I thought some of us were just tired or hangry, but it got to the point that it was what I would call irrational. Everything seemed heightened and annoying. I actually ended up snapping at one of my friends for dragging their feet and kicking up too much dust. That kind of thing never bugs me, but for some reason, it did in that moment and I couldn't help it. I wasn't the only one either. Simple bickering turned into heated arguments and deep cuts. Our innocent day of nostalgia had become a chore to get through. In retrospect, it's strange because we were clearly not feeling right, but not once did we talk about turning around and leaving like we planned to previously. Something was luring us deeper. Finally, we rounded a bend that ended up revealing the last bit of sidewalk just faded away into a big empty field. It felt incredibly anticlimactic. You know the reaction some people have when a movie cuts to black and doesn't stick the landing? The "that's it" kind of feeling? That's how we felt. I think one of us might have even said that out loud. We walked who knows how far and all we got was a lousy field to show for it. The hills surrounded the field, almost like a cove or a cul-de-sac. Crunchy yellow grass carpeted the ground. In the middle was one giant, lifeless tree. Which was weird because it was late spring after a really good rainy season, but this tree only wore rigid and empty branches. Once we shook the initial feeling of disappointment, we noticed what looked like pieces of old wood strewn about. Not like fallen branches, but more so resembling posts or panels. We felt obligated at this point to investigate it. As soon as we stepped off the path, the air changed. Almost a subtle pressurized feeling. The wood was clearly from some sort of shelter structure. I couldn't tell if it was enough to be a house or a hut, but it looked extremely weathered and almost half of the pieces were charred. My friends were trying to puzzle the wood back together, but I couldn't look away from the tree. One branch in particular. I can't explain why I was drawn to it. I was standing right under it and almost transfixed. The harder I looked, the more I could hear a sound coming from it. Which didn't make sense because it wasn't a windy day, the tree wasn't visibly moving, but I could 100% hear a sound. Like a back and forth type of sound. Like a swaying that was speaking to me. A minute or an hour could have passed and I wouldn't have known. I lost track. I was so locked onto the tree that I hadn't even noticed my friends heading back to the trail. I don't know if I ever would have noticed if not for their voices calling my name. When I looked at them, I saw each one of their faces slowly morph into a confused worry. They weren't looking at me but around me. Like when you're talking to someone and they're looking just above your eye or something. It didn't seem like any of them were looking at the same thing either. I followed on lines and couldn't figure out what they were looking at. There wasn't anything there. I rejoined the group and no one said a word. I asked what they were looking at and I couldn't get a straight answer from anyone. It was all I don't know s and nothing s. I don't think anyone wanted to sound like the crazy one. So, like every other expedition we had ever completed, we just left, very unceremoniously. Just headed back to our everyday lives like nothing happened. Before getting too far, I felt the sudden urge to sneak one last peek at the field. I can't say for sure what it was, but I know that I saw something. I think we all did, in our own way. To me it looked like a fuzzy black shadow with two piercing reflective eye-like dots. Like three-dimensional shaped TV static or a dark smudge on a pair of glasses. Almost like a translucent Rorschach test. You could probably draw any conclusion that you wanted to as to what you were seeing. I still haven't quite figured it out. What I do know is that something was under that tree when I looked back. I know that much. I don't know exactly what it was, but I don't believe that it was of this world. Before the silent film era took over Niles, the land was home to Spanish missions and the Ohlone tribe. So who knows what kind of unfortunate entities are bloodbound to those hills. My friends and I never really talked about that day ever again. I tried, but it was like pulling teeth. Every now and then I get a crumb of what someone saw or a retelling of what a friend told another friend they saw. Oddly, it didn't seem like any of us had the same experience. No one else saw the single figure under the tree like I did. Some even said they saw multiple silhouettes. Two big ones off to the side, or a big one and a couple of small ones linked together, or groups of them clashing. None if it made sense to me. How could we all share a completely different experience of the same thing? I should have known something was wrong though, because we are a reminiscing kind of group. We never hesitated to tell a story we've told or heard 1,000 times. But a hidden sidewalk and strange figures in a field didn't warrant at least a couple million retellings? It never sat right with me. Our friendships weren't the same afterward. Slowly, we stopped hanging out as much, and talked even less. No one ever tried to give a reason as to why either. We just accepted it as the way life moves. Friends got married, started families, chased careers, and had less and less time for each other until our friendships dwindled. One by one my friends started to move away. One to Texas, another to Minnesota, one went to Idaho, and one even landed in Hollywood. I believe the field pulled us there. Some days, I could feel it pulling me back. I'm sure they felt it too. I wouldn't know because they never talked to me about it. When they started moving away, it always seemed like they were trying to get as far away from it as they could. Like, they were trying to escape something. I didn't. I'm still here. And most days when I'm feeling lonely and miss my best friends, I try to replay my favorite memories of them in my head. But now when I do, I don't hear my friends anymore. All I'm able to hear is the slow, back and forth, creaking of that tree branch. We went too deep. One of the weirder things I fantasize about is handling the deaths of people I care about. Like, when one of my aunts was very ill, I imagined the extremely moving eulogy I could deliver. I would talk about the meaning she had in our lives, what made her special and unique, and everyone would cry and laugh. In a way I hate that I do this because I don't want these people to die. But there's a chance they will. I guess I want to be prepared so I can help others handle the deaths too. I can be that comfort for everyone in those times, and I feel a little pride in that. When I got with my girlfriend Tracy, I imagined being a support to her when her grandfather passed away. She was close to him. Without a father in her life, he had brought that stability. He was now in his 80s, having a lot of trouble with his heart, and every day there was a sense of today could be the day. I didn't want anything to happen to him. I hoped he'd live another decade if possible. Yet I thought a lot about the ways in which I could be there to get her through it when he did. It's kind of a hero fantasy. It's also kind of a planning fantasy. Like when you imagine how you'd escape a building if a crazed shooter showed up. You imagine the places you'd hide, exits you'd take. Or you think about how you'd sneak and conceal your identity to steal something you want to steal from a store or home. All of my fantasizing put me in a good place to jump into action when we got the news that Grandpa Terry was on his deathbed. It was a matter of days. He was coming in and out of consciousness. During his lucid moments he was talking and seemed in good spirits, they said. I barely knew Grandpa Terry. He'd been sick for years before I got with Tracy. She introduced me to him when we drove upstate once. He was a nice man. He still smoked cigars. He used to work in the jukebox business. Before he met Tracy's grandmother, he used to live with 2 women. He also claimed he got in a fistfight with Harry Belafonte. So Grandpa Terry was cool from what I saw. But I must have been just background noise to him, some guy dating his granddaughter for 3 months. When we got to the hospital, the 5th floor where they put folks who were expected to die, we found Tracy's entire family had gathered. Some I'd met and some had come from all over the country to give their farewell, bringing in coffee pots and donuts to stay as long as they needed to stay. They'd practically taken over the sitting room on the floor. Tracy asked her mother what was going on. They were speaking in whispers, but I overheard bits, enough to get the idea. He had spoken to everyone as a group and now just wanted some peace. He had had the nurse bring his brother in for a one-on-one chat and his oldest daughter. That was it. Everyone had to wait outside ever since. I was stroking Tracy's hair and letting her talk about her feelings when the nurse stepped out again. As she walked down the hallway, every family member's head raised or swiveled to her as if wondering if they would be the chosen one to receive Grandpa Terry's last words. She walked past them all to me and Tracy. I tapped Tracy gently and smiled at her. But the nurse looked at me and said, "He wants to talk to you." I explained to her that I wasn't family and she had me mixed up with someone else. Tracy was readily agreeing with me and looking around for who I could possibly have been mistaken for. "You're Douglas?" the nurse asked. When she saw me nod, she added, "Come along." I followed her, sure that she was making a mistake and I would have to come awkwardly walking back out in a few seconds. I saw the family members staring at me with incredulity and maybe resentment. If it wasn't a mistake, then I assumed I would be getting threatened with haunting if I didn't treat Tracy right. The nurse opened the door slightly, enough to allow me to squeeze in, then entered behind me, shutting the door. Inside, Grandpa Terry was propped up in bed wearing a fancy, red smoking jacket. He had a strange look about him. His skin seemed stiff and his eyes an empty black. He was like a wax figure of himself or ventriloquist dummy. His feet stuck straight up in their hard-soled slippers. Other than his eyes and his mouth, his body didn't move. It was just dressed and propped there. "Douglas," he said in clear but weakened voice, "have a seat." Well, now I knew it was me he wanted, at least. "Douglas, I've been wanting to talk to you about your ASMR videos." Of all the things he could have said to me at that moment, that wasn't even on the radar. For one, I don't talk about my ASMR videos. I didn't want anybody knowing. I hadn't even told Tracy or my friends. So how did he know about them? 2. How did this old man who still had a landline phone and used a typewriter to send letters know about ASMR videos at all? "Yes, sir," was what I managed to say. "They make me feel strange things, Douglas." "What do you mean?" I asked. "Your ASMR videos make me feel strange things, Douglas. Things I'm not supposed to feel." I'm scared of these strange things I'm feeling watching your videos, Douglas. I looked over to the nurse to see if she would intervene or explain. The nurse stood impassively in the corner of the room with a towel over one arm. She resembled more a bathroom attendant. Her presence unnerved me further. Yes, I talked to the nurse about ASMR and she has told me that I am supposed to feel a pleasant tingling sensation that starts at my scalp. When I watch your ASMR videos, I don't feel a pleasant tingling sensation that starts at my scalp. When I watch your ASMR videos, I feel strange things I can't explain or describe. Like that feeling when you say a word so many times it doesn't sound like the right word anymore, but about everything. Worse and stranger. These are strange things, Douglas, strange things to feel. They make me afraid. I'm sorry, I said. I'm not supposed to feel these strange things watching your videos, Douglas. I'm not supposed to feel these strange things ever, I don't think. I'm not supposed to have these feelings. Your ASMR videos make me remember things I haven't remembered since I was a little boy. It has been so long since I remembered these things. I only know they're memories because it's all so familiar. If they aren't memories, how can it feel like I've been there? If they aren't memories, how are these places in my head? These places and things I remember give me those strange feelings, Douglas. The nurse still stood with the towel saying nothing. I didn't like the things Grandpa was saying and I didn't like that I had no support in this room from the only professional. I don't think I can help you, sir, I answered. Maybe just watch someone else's videos? No, you did something in those videos to make me feel strange things. Why? What did you do? I stood up to leave. I felt at this point I should get the family involved. I was only agitating a poor, dying man. This man had fist-fought Harry Belafonte, he shouldn't be arguing with me about ASMR videos. I need to go further in, he said. Your videos take me part of the way to where I'm slipping between a bit awake and a bit asleep. That's when these memories and strange feelings come down. It's sudden. Like my head nodding as I'm falling asleep. Just like when my head nods, it makes me snap back out. I lose it. It's just a hazy impression. I need to go further in, Douglas. I don't have much longer. If I die now. If I die without going in. I need you to do your ASMR to help me. There was a knock on the door. I heard Tracy asking, "Is everything okay in there?" The nurse sprang like a bear trap, darting across the 12 feet or so to the door and announced, "Everything is fine, ma'am, please don't disturb the patient any further." I heard a stifled sob, I think, but there were no further disturbances. The nurse remained at the door, effectively blocking me if I tried to escape. I can show you my other videos, sure, but wouldn't you rather spend your last moments with your family? They're out there. I know, Douglas, I know, he said in an agonized voice. But I can't do that until I understand. I pulled out my phone and was getting YouTube up when he said, "Come over here and pretend you're applying makeup on me." There's a makeup kit in the drawer there, the nurse got it. I walked over to the stand he was pointing out. In the drawer, I found a compact with some different eyeshadow colors, foundation in a few skin tones, blush and bronze, 2 different sizes of brush, some eyebrow pencils, mascara and lipstick in the shade Pina Colada. "Take me further in, Douglas," Grandpa Terry said. I felt really weird about this. I felt trapped because it seemed like this was a man's dying wish. But it's like he had this planned. How did he know I would even be here? Tracy asked me at the last minute. She said she had intended to go with her sister. How long had he been waiting for this? Plus he was an old man who had done manly stuff all his life. I didn't want to pretend to apply makeup on him. It was weird. Maybe I should just do a fake eye exam or... "Just bring that stuff over here, set it on my belly and start," he said, his patience clearly wearing thin. I did as he asked, loading up the items and setting them gently on the old man's smoking jacket. I looked over to the nurse at the door to see if she was watching me. She was still facing the door. The old man looked up at me expectantly. It was like someone asking you to sing in front of them when you just don't do that. Let me see what we got here first, I said. This was something I like to do in my videos. Take my time, handle objects, examine them. Some folks get the tingles from that. Grandpa nodded. Got some nice colors in here, I said, to myself, about the eyeshadow set. I started reading off some of the color names. On I went, examining each item, reading off ingredients, muttering this and that. Then I told him I would start with applying a foundation layer. I think he'd entered some kind of trance. He seemed to be looking through me. I'm in a strange town, an older part of town, wrong side of it, don't stop. Please! I was so shocked to hear him start speaking, I had stopped what I was doing to listen. I went back to pretending to apply foundation to Grandpa Terry and explaining how important it is to get a nice, even coat. I don't know if that's true. With ASMR, reality doesn't matter. Let me ramble, I'll ramble and you roleplay. Yes, I know this place, where the concrete is crumbling under an abandoned overpass and along the old off-ramp a little shop. What is this shop? It's so late, why is it still open? Who comes to this place? The images of the place he described rose vividly into my mind like long-forgotten memories. Vivid, yet strange, disconnected from the vast body of memories that form my regular biography. I must have seen this place somewhere before. It felt so familiar. What was this place he was describing? I didn't like this. I was getting nervous. But I got out the eyebrow pencil and kept making motions in front of the entranced face. The inside has a nice wood flooring. Unusual flooring for this place. Merchandise placed tidily on shelves. What are they selling? What is this, merchandise? There are a few customers inside looking at the ad merchandise. A woman is behind the counter. Nobody notices me. They aren't right. Is this a memory? I feel like I can move. Move on my own. There's a dark corner with something valuable. I should go to it. Make me go further, Douglas. I laid it on thick, making swish sounds with my mouth as I swiped with the eyebrow pencil and murmuring to myself. I leaned in closer to his ear and said something about eyebrows. Douglas, he shouted, his voice tinged with chilling levels of alarm. They see me now. Oh no, I can't go, I mustn't move. Oh God, they're all looking at me. I tried to tell him he's fine and safe, but he continued, what is this place? They say I shouldn't be here. Douglas, they heard you too. They can see you. How? Douglas, stop moving, stop for the love of God. I stopped instantly. I felt a cold shiver, nothing like ASMR, run through me. My foreboding had culminated dread. What Grandpa described felt real. I can't explain it, but I could almost see it. They're coming, he blurted in panic. Douglas, help me get out of here. I can't get out. Help! They're mad at us. More makeup. I looked to the nurse hoping she would inject him with a sedative. He clawed the air for my help. I hastily pretended to apply lipstick to him, making little pop sounds with my mouth and feeling stupid the whole time. I'm in a high-rise now, Grandpa Terry said, much calmer now. It's being converted to apartments. There's a crane machine far away. Nobody's here. It's brown. I take an elevator up to a high-up floor, but not the top. It's the 35th floor, isn't it? I asked on impulse. I remembered this place too. I don't remember remembering it before just then, but I was sure I'd seen it. I feel strange, Grandpa Terry said. Me too, I said. We should stop. No! Please! I need to go further in. Please! With a sigh, I started swishing eyeshadow. There's no way we could both have vague, distant memories of these very particular places. I'd had dreams of this place. Glimpses somehow. I felt like we were messing with something we shouldn't be. Yet I continued. This floor is unfinished. I enter one of the apartments, 26, to look around. Windows haven't been installed. Plastic sheeting blows inward. It's so dark in here. It's a long apartment. One long hallway with a few little rooms. Modern. Down that one way there's the bathroom, I think. I need to use the bathroom. This room's closed. The door is closed. I felt a wave of dread that made my limbs weak. I fumbled the eyeshadow, dropping it on Grandpa Terry, making a dusty mess on his smoking jacket. I expected him to yell at me, but he didn't seem to notice. I grabbed the mascara and made some swishes. Someone's on the other side of this door, he said. Grandpa made a long ee sound that chilled my blood. Someone's in there, he half squealed, half whispered. I'm sure of it. I feel someone on the other side of the door waiting. They've been waiting. It wants to harm me. It wants us to open the door. To harm us. It knows we're here. They know what I'm saying and what we're thinking. The person on the other side of the door knows things. It wants to hurt us real bad. I had started shaking Grandpa Terry to snap him out of it. I hoped he was crazy, but I was trembling and deeply disturbed by what he was saying. This place was real. We shouldn't be doing this, Douglas. I was wrong. We're in danger. I'm not doing this anymore, I shouted. No more ASMR, snap out of it. I didn't even care if his family heard and came running. I just wanted him to knock it off. Nobody did come running, though. Even the nurse just kept her post at the door. I'll walk away and maybe it'll stay there in that closed room, just stay there forever waiting. Maybe it can't open the door. Maybe they'll just stand there for all time. Just like before. No, they won't wait much longer. I need to go. Come on, drop it, old man. You're freaking me out. I shouted. It knows. It knows we're right here. It won't let me just go. It's going to come out. It's something from outside. Help me get out, Douglas. More ASMR, cranial nerve exam, quick. This is insane, I said. I won't. Grandpa Terry's eyes opened wide and he started to scream. Blood formed in the corner of his eyes. I looked to the nurse and demanded she help him. She handed me a stethoscope and a pen. I was desperate and maybe she knew something, I don't know, medical benefits of ASMR. I did it. I started moving the pen around in the air, asking him to follow it with his eyes. Oh, thank God, he sighed and I could feel it too. We had transitioned somewhere else. I'm not sure how I knew, but I knew. We're in a department store, he said. After hours, so dark in here, I haven't been here since I was a kid, but it's different now, deeper. How'd it get deeper? There are still people here shopping. Oh no, they're all here. Have to keep going. I moved my fingers in and out of his view frame, pretending he was telling me, stop when he saw my fingers and telling him good. I struggled to do this while my hands shook and I felt sick inside. I knew this place. I'd seen it. I'd been there as a kid too, and I dreamed of it. It had gotten deeper. It was a bad place. He had to get outside quick. I'm going to go outside, have to get outside, it's at the far end, the deepest. Good, I said, good. Now sharp or dull? I found the doors, he announced after minutes of quiet panic. I'm going out into the parking lot, so dark, a few cars in the dark, and streetlights, nothing beyond, dark everywhere, some grasses and a gas station far, far away, not really there. We made a mistake, Douglas. They're out, they're coming out, they know they see you looking at you through me, those cold empty eyes, these weren't memories. I threw the stethoscope against the wall. I began making as many loud, obnoxious noises as I could. Hitting the metal frame of the bed. Coughing. Anti-ASMR sounds. I heard the door open. I expected the family to come charging in, wondering what I was doing to the family patriarch. In fact, the sound was just the nurse leaving. She gingerly shut the door behind her. When I turned back, Grandpa Terry was dead. His eyes were frozen in terror, Trickles of blood ran from the corners and from his ears. I backed to the door and left the room. I had to go tell this family now that Grandpa Terry died while I, practically a stranger, spent his last moments. But I didn't have to. Nobody was there. His family had just left. It was inexplicable. Where had they gone? Where was the nurse? I checked the sitting room. Nobody was there, just the boxes of donuts and tanks of coffee. I asked at the desk and nobody knew what I was talking about. All they cared about was one of their patients was now dead. I texted Tracy to let her know her beloved grandfather had just passed while she wandered off. She never answered. She never returned my calls. Ever. She disappeared from my life. From everything, social media, all of it. She was just gone. I never saw or heard from her or her family again. I couldn't understand it. I stopped making ASMR videos after that. I haven't stopped watching them, though. Sometimes I dream of these places still, places like the ones Grandpa Terry described. But it's okay. He was right, the videos aren't enough to get deep. I keep feeling like, maybe someday I'll see the old man in there, and sometimes I think I feel him just around the corner, but deeper, and I feel a warning that we went too deep. It started with an itch, the kind you dismiss as a stray irritant or the side effect of a poorly washed shirt. Nothing serious, just a vague discomfort on my forearm that I could scratch away without a second thought. By the next day, though, that itch had spread, snaking its way up my arm in patches that seemed to appear and vanish like ghostly bruises. When I looked closer, I saw faint outlines, almost like impressions beneath my skin, lines that seemed too precise to be random. As the hours passed, I became acutely aware of that crawling, tingling sensation, as if something was squirming right under the surface, trailing like whispered secrets I couldn't ignore. I forced myself to laugh about it, though the unease was already beginning to curl in my stomach. My friends joked that it was probably a new allergy or the side effect of too much late-night junk food. But this wasn't an allergy, I knew that. It was something else entirely, something I couldn't easily explain away. By the end of the day, I found myself instinctively covering the patches with my sleeves, hoping no one would notice how much I was scratching. There was no rash, nothing visible that should have made the itching so unbearable, but the irritation was constant, almost hypnotic in its persistence. And then, as I stood in front of my bathroom mirror that evening, rolling up my sleeve to inspect the strange marks, I noticed something far worse. The skin on my forearm seemed uneven. Beneath it, as I pressed gently with my fingers, I could feel tiny bumps, like grains of sand shifting beneath the surface. My mind instantly jumped to all the horror stories I'd ever heard about parasites, though I dismissed it as soon as the thought arrived. But I couldn't deny the physical reality, couldn't brush away the sensation that something was undeniably, horrifyingly wrong. That night, as I lay in bed, trying not to scratch, I felt that subtle shifting again, like a ripple running through the skin of my arm. It was slight, barely more than a whisper against my senses, but it was there, undeniable. I lay motionless, eyes wide open, feeling the unwelcome activity beneath my skin, a silent protest against sleep. In a fit of desperation, I'd slathered on every ointment I could find, hoping it might soothe whatever was festering beneath. But as I closed my eyes, willing myself to ignore the sensation, a single thought began to gnaw at the edges of my mind. What if it's not just in my arm? What if it's spreading? The itch, I realized, wasn't just an annoyance anymore. It was a warning, a signal that something within me had started, and I had no idea how to make it stop. The itch had spread by morning. What began as a single patch on my forearm had now crept up to my shoulder and down to my wrist. Each area tingled with an unnerving sensation, like ants crawling just beneath the skin, tracing invisible pathways along my nerves. I spent breakfast awkwardly holding my coffee mug, trying not to let my family see how much I was scratching. I could still hear my sister's voice from the night before, mocking me for imagining things and being paranoid. But this was beyond imagination. The bumps under my skin were real. I tried my best to avoid mirrors that morning, but the bathroom one caught me off guard as I reached for my toothbrush. My reflection stared back with dark, hollow eyes, evidence of a sleepless night spent tossing and turning. The skin on my forearm had taken on a strange, dull tone, slightly bruised and sunken where the itch was strongest. I pressed down on the spot again, feeling the telltale grit of tiny lumps shifting beneath the surface. They felt more distinct today, as if they had grown overnight, settling into my skin with a sickening permanence. During my lunch break, I finally gave into the impulse to Google my symptoms. Each result was worse than the last: nerve disorders, rare skin diseases, parasitic infections. My stomach churned with dread, but I couldn't stop reading, hypnotized by the horrifying possibilities. In the back of my mind, I tried to rationalize it away. Maybe it was stress? My job had been piling on the pressure lately, and I'd barely had a decent night's sleep in weeks. But even as I thought this, I knew it was a weak excuse. Nothing about stress explained the feeling of something moving, something alive, beneath my skin. By afternoon, the sensation had evolved. It was no longer just an itch, it was an almost rhythmic pulse, as though whatever was under my skin was slowly waking up, becoming aware. I couldn't shake the feeling that it was probing, seeking something within me. When I wasn't scratching, I was pressing my fingers against the bumps, trying to understand what they were. But each time, they slipped and shifted away from my touch, evading me like shadows under the skin. As the day dragged on, the anxiety began to bleed into every part of me. I found myself barely focusing at work, my mind consumed with the alien presence in my own body. Colleagues cast worried glances my way, but I ignored them, unwilling to explain. Who would believe me? That I felt things crawling under my skin? I barely believed it myself. I left work early, ignoring the concerned expressions of my manager and the odd questions from friends. As soon as I got home, I headed straight to the bathroom, rolling up my sleeve with a trembling hand. The patches of uneven skin had spread even further, branching like the veins in a leaf. It was now unmistakably clear that they were following a pattern, some kind of system that only they understood. Unable to resist, I took a needle and carefully pressed it to the skin of my forearm, hoping that a small puncture might release whatever was trapped inside. The prick stung, and a bead of blood welled up, but nothing more. Frustrated, I pressed harder, trying to dig deeper, feeling the pressure build as I forced the needle further. But instead of relief, I felt a sharp, searing pain rip through my arm, and the skin buckled under my touch, pulsing in angry protest. I pulled the needle away, horrified, realizing I was only making it worse. I sank onto the bathroom floor, clutching my arm, my mind racing. Whatever was beneath my skin, it didn't want to be disturbed. I couldn't go to work the next day. The moment I tried to put on a shirt, the rough fabric brushed against my arm, igniting the sensation into a maddening fury. Every nerve seemed on edge, every inch of skin prickling with the unnatural movement underneath. It was as if my own body was rebelling, each patch of skin tightening over the hidden lumps as they shifted and pulsed. I spent the morning in bed, sleeves rolled up, staring in morbid fascination as the trails of tiny lumps spread across my arm, weaving along my veins. The sight was dizzying. The tiny, gritty bumps beneath my skin were following a path, creating a map only they understood. I felt helpless, staring at my own body as it transformed into something unrecognizable. I was no longer just me, I was becoming their host, my skin their shelter, my body their prison. Around noon, I heard my phone buzz on the bedside table. It was a message from my sister, checking in after our conversation the previous night. I couldn't bring myself to answer. How could I explain that what I tried to brush off as a skin irritation had become a full-blown infestation? I couldn't even say the words to myself. Instead, I turned off the phone, cutting myself off from anyone who might try to reach out. This was mine to face, alone. The hours dragged on, and the daylight began to dim outside. I lay still, paralyzed by fear and a morbid fascination, unable to tear my gaze from the gradual spread of the patches across my skin. I was half caught in a trance, a waking nightmare that felt both surreal and inescapable. With every pulse, the bumps moved, shifting in sync with the beat of my own heart. They seemed to understand me in a way that was unnerving, as though each beat was their cue, each pause their signal. The itching had dulled, replaced by something else, a raw, aching feeling as though my skin was being stretched from the inside. I ran my fingers along my arm, feeling the uneven texture beneath my touch, the lines and patches that had become almost a network. With a grim determination, I resolved to find out what they were, to confront whatever I had allowed to take root inside me. Grabbing a small utility knife from my bedside drawer, I took a deep breath. My hand trembled, but I steadied it, pressing the blade just above one of the larger bumps on my forearm. A quick, shallow slice. Blood welled immediately, a thin line of red, but beyond the pain, I felt nothing else, no release, no dislodging of whatever was beneath. I wiped the blood away with a tissue, squinting as I tried to catch a glimpse of anything unusual within the shallow cut. And then, as if in response, the bump under the skin moved. Slowly, it shifted just out of reach, retreating deeper, avoiding the light and the blade, evading me. My stomach turned, a nauseating wave washing over me. It was alive. A living thing, crawling just beneath my skin, aware of my attempts to remove it. I stumbled back, clutching my arm, horror clawing up my throat as I realized the full extent of what was happening. Whatever was inside me, it wasn't some random irritation, some easily excised intruder. It was something intelligent, something that knew how to evade, how to survive. I looked down, breathing shallow, watching the faint pulse beneath the surface, the outline of its path, winding its way along my arm and toward my shoulder. The creeping sensation resumed, stronger now, winding through my skin like roots sinking into soil, spreading with a mind of its own. I barely slept that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I felt the thing inside me moving, pulsing in time with my heart, twisting beneath the skin as though it was carving out its territory, claiming its host. My dreams were fevered flashes, glimpses of crawling shadows, of roots and tendrils winding their way through dark soil. And each time I jolted awake, that crawling, pressing sensation was there, more pronounced, as if the thing had grown while I slept, as if it had waited for my moments of weakness to sink deeper. By morning, the transformation was undeniable. My skin had taken on a translucent pallor, faint veins crisscrossing in unnatural patterns. The bumps had spread down my forearm and up my shoulder, each one connected in a network of winding lines, an intricate web that seemed to pulse with a life of its own. I could no longer pretend this was something that could be explained or ignored. Whatever this was, it was taking me over, using my own body as a canvas to display its growth. Desperation drove me to reach out, to find someone, anyone, who might know what was happening. I thumbed through my contacts until I found an old professor from university, Dr. Talbot, who had once taught a course on rare skin conditions and parasites. I hadn't spoken to him in years, but the memory of his meticulous knowledge, his almost obsessive fascination with the peculiarities of human biology, pushed me to call. My voice was ragged, edged with panic as I explained my symptoms. When I finished, there was a long pause, then a low, measured reply. "This sounds unlike anything I've encountered, but it resembles certain parasitic infections. A rare few are known to mimic the patterns of the host's nervous or circulatory system. If it's following a path, it might be attempting to synchronize with you, perhaps even taking on your body's blueprint." His words only intensified my dread. Synchronizing? Taking on my body's blueprint? My grip tightened on the phone as I fought back the urge to scream. How do I stop it?" "I can't say," he replied, his tone eerily calm. "But I know one thing, most organisms that invade a host need something from them. Nutrients, control, even full integration. If this thing is synchronizing with you, it may be trying to merge in a way that cannot be undone. The longer you wait, the harder it will be to remove it." After hanging up, I found myself staring blankly at my arm, which felt less and less like it belonged to me. His words echoed in my mind: integration, merge, host. The implications rattled me to my core, an awareness that I was losing control not just of my arm, but of my very identity. I was becoming something else. I grabbed my keys and stumbled out of my apartment, searching for answers or help or anything that might stop this. The sunlight felt harsh on my skin, each step sending waves of heat through my body, an unwelcome reminder that whatever was inside me seemed to thrive on my discomfort, feeding off the fear and pain that coiled inside. I headed to the nearest clinic, hoping a doctor might offer some concrete, medical explanation, something rational and fixable. In the sterile brightness of the examination room, I showed the physician my arm, rolling up my sleeve with a resigned dread. Her face paled, eyes widening as she took in the web of bumps and lines, the undeniable network of trails tracing across my skin. She tried to hide her reaction, but I saw the flash of unease as she hesitated, as though unsure where to even begin. "We might need to run some tests," she murmured, but her voice sounded distant, as if I were underwater, hearing her through layers of fog. I watched as she examined my skin with gloved hands, her expression carefully blank. She pressed lightly along the bumps, and I felt that sickening shift beneath my skin, the creature, or creatures, moving away from her touch as though defiant, aware of the intrusion. "Are you experiencing any mental effects?" she asked, her words unnervingly cautious. I hesitated, considering what to say. How could I explain the whispers that lingered in my mind, the strange, unsettling connection I was beginning to feel with the thing beneath my skin? It was no longer just a parasite or a disease. I could feel it now, pressing not only against my nerves but against my very thoughts, settling into the edges of my consciousness. I realized, with a shiver of horror, that it wasn't just feeding on my body, it was feeding on my mind, integrating itself in ways I hadn't thought possible. I met the doctor's gaze, but before I could answer, the creature moved again, this time with a distinct purpose, stretching along my arm and creeping toward my chest. The sensation was stronger, more insistent, as if it knew I was seeking help, as if it were tightening its hold. I gasped, the air seizing in my lungs as the realization crashed over me, it didn't want to leave. It was fighting back, cementing its hold, rooting itself deeper. In a final, desperate surge, I tried to push the creature back, pressing hard against my skin, willing it to recede, to give me some control. But the effort only seemed to strengthen it, each pulse intensifying, until the creature's movements settled into a steady, relentless rhythm, matching the beat of my own heart, synchronizing. I stumbled out of the clinic, numb and exhausted, feeling my body slipping from my grasp, 1 inch at a time. The world blurred around me, sounds fading into a thick, buzzing murmur. Somewhere behind me, the doctor's voice drifted out, muffled and distant, like it was sinking beneath water. "Wait, we need to, it could be dangerous," but her words dissolved into the haze, swallowed by the relentless, pulsing rhythm crawling through my veins, drowning out everything else. As I walked home, I could sense it fully now, its presence growing stronger, not just in my arm, but in my mind. It was learning me, molding me, transforming me from the inside out. By the time I reached my door, I knew, deep down, that I was no longer alone in my own skin. Whatever it was there to stay. That night, as I lay in bed, the final thread of hope unraveled. The creature had embedded itself so deeply that my body no longer felt like mine. Every movement, every heartbeat, every breath felt heavy and foreign, as if I were merely a shell that it inhabited. The skin on my arm and shoulder was now discolored and swollen, an angry, bruised landscape where the thing had claimed its domain. It looked sickly, bloated and taut, veins stretched to their limit and crisscrossing in unnatural directions. The itching sensation had vanished entirely, replaced by a thick, pulsing ache. My skin felt too tight, like something was building pressure beneath the surface, straining to break free. I couldn't resist anymore. I needed to see the full extent of its invasion. Moving slowly, I peeled my shirt away, exposing my shoulder and upper chest, where the network of bumps and lines had spread. The creature's presence pulsed in time with my heart, a foreign rhythm that matched my own, yet somehow felt independent, like an echo that shouldn't exist. With trembling hands, I touched the swollen patch on my chest, feeling the unnatural warmth radiate from beneath. The skin was stretched to a grotesque degree, almost translucent, as if it were thinning out, dissolving into something weaker, more penetrable. I leaned in closer to the mirror, watching the faint, rippling movements under the surface. And then, to my horror, I saw it, a slick, sickly glint of something dark and oily, shifting just beneath the skin, oozing and coiling like thick, viscous sludge. Unable to stop myself, I dug my nails into the taut skin, pulling until it broke. The pain was sharp and immediate, but my horror and curiosity overpowered the agony. I tore at the opening, and as the skin gave way, something thick and mucus-like began to seep out. It was dark, almost black, with a sickly green hue under the bathroom light, and it carried a smell so foul it felt like a punch to the senses, a mix of rotting meat and decay, something ancient and foul that had no business being inside a living human. The substance pooled on the surface of my skin, thick and syrupy, like tar. It clung to my fingers, trailing in viscous strings as I tried to wipe it away, only for more to seep out, spilling from the wound like an infection brought to life. I stumbled back, gasping, as the creature within me seemed to react, shifting and writhing with a newfound aggression, as though angered by my attempt to purge it. Then, from the open wound, something far worse emerged. Tiny, translucent tendrils began to poke through, curling outward like roots seeking soil. Each tendril was thin and worm-like, with a sickening wet sheen that glistened under the light. They wriggled, twisting and curling, exploring the air as if tasting their surroundings, seeking something beyond the confines of my body. In a fit of panic, I slapped my hand over the wound, pressing hard to stop the flow, to force those writhing things back inside. But they continued to push against my hand, stretching and straining, their thin, squirming lengths winding between my fingers, slithering over my knuckles, searching. I could feel them coiling around my hand, cold and damp, with a texture that felt somewhere between slime and rot. My vision blurred with horror, but I couldn't stop looking, couldn't tear myself away from the monstrous sight unfolding on my own body. With a growing sense of dread, I noticed something new, small, tooth-like structures forming at the ends of each tendril. Tiny, needle-thin spines, sharp and white, poked out from the ends, flexing as though testing their strength. And then, before I could pull my hand away, one of the tendrils latched onto my skin, its spine sinking in with a sickening prick. I gasped, feeling the sting as it burrowed into my flesh, anchoring itself to me. It began to pulse, pulling itself deeper, its body stretching and elongating as it forced its way under my skin. I could feel each movement, each invasive push as it dug deeper, the sensation raw and visceral, a throbbing agony that burned through me. More tendrils followed, each one latching on, digging in with their needle-like teeth, burrowing beneath my hand, winding up my arm, creating a lattice of pain that seemed to spread in all directions. I tried to pull them off, but they were rooted firmly, part of me now, merging with my skin, my muscles, fusing in a grotesque symbiosis. The creature was no longer content to hide beneath the surface. It was emerging, claiming me from the inside out, leaving no part of me untouched. I could feel it seeping through every cell, binding to my bones, spreading through my veins like a dark, invasive rot. And with each tendril that burrowed deeper, I could feel a change in my mind as well, a dull, creeping sense of surrender, as though the thing inside me was whispering, coaxing, merging its thoughts with mine. I could no longer remember what it felt like to be just me. Until dawn. A crashing sound that reverberated from outside startled me awake. I groaned to myself as I rolled over and reached out my hand, searching for my phone. I felt the cold surface of my phone and pulled it up to eye level. After double tapping the screen, the time popped up. 3:47 a.m. I shook my head and threw the blankets off of me, slowly crawling out of bed. My feet hit the cold floor, making me shudder slightly as I made my way to the bathroom. As I was coming back to my room, another loud sound came from outside, causing me to jump. I entered my room and walked over to the window, peeking out. I scanned the neighborhood, seeing nothing unusual. My heart stopped as I noticed an uncanny figure standing at the top of my street. One thing I should mention is that I lived in a rather rural area, with only 5 houses on my street with quite a distance between each house. The area is slightly wooded, taking about 15 minutes to reach the closest civilized area. I watched the figure carefully, and the panic sank in as it made its way down the street. Something was terribly wrong. The way it walked and held itself was off, almost inhuman. It walked slowly, its body contorting slightly as it did so, and he was so tall, much taller than the average man. As he approached my house, a pit grew in my stomach. He paused between my house and my neighbor's, then walked between the houses and disappeared. I crossed the room back to my bed where I picked up my phone. I unlocked it and called Remy, my fiancé, who was staying at his friend's for the night. After the third ring he answered. "Is everything okay, baby?" His voice was low and raspy, and I knew I had woken him up. "Can you come home? There's someone walking around the neighborhood and I'm getting scared." I could hear shuffling over the phone and I immediately knew he was going to come home. "Yes, I'm getting my stuff and I'm headed home in less than a minute." "Can you still see him?" "No. He disappeared between the neighbors and our house." "Okay, I need you to check all doors and windows, take the Glock with you." "Okay, please hurry. I'll be home in 10 minutes. I love you." "I love you too," I said before I hung up. I walked over to the nightstand, opened the drawer, pulled out the Glock, and made sure that it was loaded. I went back to the window and looked out again, but there was nothing there. I let out a shaky breath as I checked all the upstairs windows to make sure I locked them before slowly going downstairs. I went to every door and window, doing the same thing with them, then going back upstairs and to the bedroom window. I knew Remy would be home in the next minute or so and felt the panic subside. I looked down at my phone briefly and then back to the window. My body froze, almost screaming as the figure was now standing in front of my house, facing me. It didn't move as it stood there and I wasn't sure if it was even breathing. It was hard to make out any details as the street was almost completely dark. There were no street lights in front of my house, only a few were scattered across the neighborhood. I wasn't sure what to do. What was I supposed to do in a situation like this? I watched and watched, praying that Remy would get home before anything happened. I quickly pulled out my phone and texted him. "He's standing outside the house. I'll be there in a minute, keep the gun on you at all times." I put my phone back down and returned my eyes to the window. What the fuck? The figure was now gone, no trace that it had ever been there. I scanned the neighborhood, hoping to see him. It would make me feel a hell of a lot better if I knew where he was. Nothing could possibly go wrong if I knew where he was. I kept looking outside until I saw headlights coming down the street and into the driveway. I ran down the stairs, almost tripping to meet Remy at the door. I placed my phone on the little table that sat by our front door and unlocked it as soon as his foot touched the porch, and he quickly came inside, locking the door behind him. He pulled me into a hug and I let out a breath as I melted into him. He kissed the top of my head before lifting mine to meet his gaze. He looked tired, dark bags under his eyes. Nonetheless, he still looked happy to see me. He had a dark red t-shirt on and a pair of black sweatpants that fit him perfectly. His blonde hair was pushed back off his face and you could tell he had rushed to get home. He looked gorgeous in every sense of the word. I wanted to go upstairs and lie down with him. He was my safe space, and when I was with him, I felt like nothing could go wrong. He placed his phone and keys next to mine on the table. I saw nothing when I pulled into the neighborhood. He disappeared when I was texting you. I have no clue where he is. Let's go back upstairs. I'm sure everything is okay now. I'm sorry for calling you so late. I know you were at Adam's house and were excited to spend some time with him during the off-season. Why are you sorry? Your safety comes first. I smiled at his response. With the gun in one hand, I placed my free hand on his chest and got on my tiptoes to kiss him. He kissed me back, his fingers tangled in my hair. He took the gun from my hand and placed it into his waistband, before wrapping his arms around my waist and hoisting me up. I wrapped myself around him, laying my head on his shoulder. He moved his arm and his hand lifted my head. I smiled at him brightly as I leaned forward and kissed him again. The kiss lasted for maybe a minute before we pulled apart for air. I let out a giggle as I looked into his eyes filled with love. He spun in a circle, causing the both of us to laugh. I love the little moments like this. All right, baby, let's go get some sleep. He whispered in my ear before placing a kiss on it. Sounds good to me, gorgeous. I'm tired as hell. He chuckled softly as I placed my head back on his shoulder, kissing it gently while taking me upstairs. The relief I had felt when Remy arrived quickly vanished. The sound of breaking glass pierced the silence as we made it to the top of the stairs. It came from the back of the house, which told us he had broken our glass back door. He placed me down on my feet. I froze and looked up at Remy, who was reaching for the gun in his waistband. In a sudden movement, he was pushing me to the room closest to us and locking the door. We stood in silence, listening for any sound that would give us any clue as to what was going on. There was a crunching sound as the intruder stepped into the house. The house was quiet before we heard it started moving around the first floor of the house. I looked over to Remy, who was deep in thought, before he glanced over at me. He placed a finger over his mouth, indicating that I needed to remain silent. He grabbed my hand, walked towards the door, and opened the door slowly. He led me out of the room, moving so that he was behind me and now pushing me forward. We silently but quickly moved towards the back of the house to get as far away as possible from the intruder. We made it into our bedroom. Remy locked the door behind him and then turned to face me. I didn't know what to say to him at the moment, nothing but fear on my mind. He kept me close to him, pressing me into his side, while I stared blankly at the door with my head leaning onto his arms. My hands were shaking uncontrollably and my body felt like it was on fire. Something about this felt extremely off, and I guess it would, considering what was going on. My throat was dry and my heart was racing in my chest, so much so that it hurt. Remy, I left my phone downstairs. Remy stopped and stared at me for a moment before patting his own pockets, his face contorting to shock. So did I. Remy? What the fuck is going on? I whispered. I don't know. It was only a matter of time before my mind would shut down from the panic. It was unfortunate, but it's how I've always responded in traumatic situations. Remy was more level-headed and logical. He could stay strong and take control in situations like these. Before I could say anything else, Remy was already at the window, tugging it upwards, but it didn't move. He tried repeatedly until he gave up in frustration, reeling back to punch the window but stopping himself before his fist hit the window. We had never been able to open that window, the pain had sealed it shut. If he was getting nervous, it wasn't showing. His face remained stoic, which comforted me. I knew that as long as he was by my side I would be okay. We could hear the intruder making its way up the stairs, its footsteps heavy as he came to the top of the stairs. The sound of a door opening was heard, and we knew it was looking for us. It became very clear that whoever was in our house was not here to rob us. We were under attack. The intruder went from door to door, and as he got closer, we needed to think of a plan. Remy gripped the gun tighter and held it so that if he needed to shoot, he could. Honey, I want you to stay with me as much as possible. Remy, I'm scared. I whimpered as I shuffled closer to him, latching onto him. He ran his hand through my hair and leaned down to kiss my head, which gave me some comfort. It was the little moments like this that reminded me of why I loved him so much. I know, baby, but I need you to be strong for me. I will, but what if something happens to you? We'll cross that bridge when we get there. I didn't really like that answer, but I wasn't about to argue with him. As the last remaining doors continued to be slammed open, I could hear my heart beating in my chest. Remy perked up, thinking of something. He pointed at the dresser and motioned for me to follow him, hiding ourselves between the dresser and the wall. He understood we were cornering ourselves, but it was the best idea that he could come up with at the moment. My back was pushed up against the wall. Remy's body covered me from being seen. The back of Remy's body was touching my mind, and I felt comfort from the warmth that radiated from him. He glanced back at me, offering me a soft smile, which I managed to return. Guilt flooded over me as I felt like I had dragged him into this mess. It made me wonder what would have happened if I didn't call him to come home. We'll be okay, darling, Remy whispered warmly as he reached for my hand. The only thing I could do was nod. The conversation was cut short as the doorknob twisted. He had reached our room, and I fully began to panic. We could see the shadow of his feet slipping under the door. He stood there, waiting, and we could hear his heavy breathing. There was a whistling sound whenever he inhaled, followed by a groan occasionally when he breathed out. I could feel sweat form on my forehead as my hands began to shake again. My legs felt weak and leaned onto Remy. Remy jumped as the door splintered as it came off its hinges, pushing me further into the wall behind me. He quickly regained his composure, giving me a quick glance before turning his attention back to the door. I didn't know Remy could see, and I was too scared to look myself. The silence was deafening before a voice rang out. "I can smell you." The intruder growled, his voice guttural. I had never heard anything like that before, and it took everything in me to not run. Remy's grip on my hand tightened as we stayed hidden beside the dresser. I pressed my face into Remy's back as I braced for the worst. I could feel the muscles in his back tense as he raised his arms. The horror set in as I realized what he was about to do. He was going to shoot. I lifted my head to see what was folding in front of me. My breath hitched in my throat as I finally saw the intruder. Now Remy was tall, standing at 6 feet 3 inches, but the man who stood in front of us was much taller. He had straggly, shoulder-length hair that looked like it hadn't washed in years. He stood hunched over, his arms disproportionately long. He was dirty, and the smell that came off of him made me gag. Remy had the gun raised, and he began pulling the trigger, ready to do whatever he needed to protect us. "Don't come any closer," Remy demanded. "Or what?" the man taunted. "Find out," Remy hissed. The man let out a rasp of a laugh that sent chills down my spine. I could feel Remy tense even more as the man took a step closer. Remy took a deep breath and changed his stance into something more defensive. It happened in a matter of seconds. The man took a large step forward, nearly closing the distance between us. Remy fired a shot, hitting the man successfully in the chest. Everything went silent before a sharp pain shot through my ears. Remy was yelling something, but it was muffled, the ringing in my ears triumphing, causing me to clamp my hands over my ears, my eyes stuck on the scene in front of me. Tears poured freely down my face, sobbing as I buried my face back into Remy's back. The man froze, looking down at his chest before laughing again. He continued his advances towards us, causing Remy to fire off 2 more rounds. The man stumbled backward, clutching his chest. Everything felt like it was moving in slow motion. Remy used this opportunity to grab my arm, pushing past the man. We ran out of the room and into the hallway. The man gave chase, cornering and pushing us into the guest bedroom. Remy slammed the door shut behind us, turning around to face me. The look on his was pure horror. "What the fuck is that?" I cried. "Your guess is as good as mine." Remy quickly released the magazine to check how much ammo we had left. "We have 7 shots left." I walked to a corner of the room and slid down the wall. I pulled my knees into my chest and I cried into them. I was shaking like a leaf. Remy moved closer to me. He kneeled in front of me and pried my head from my hands, holding my face in my hands. "Honey, I know this is difficult, but I need you to calm down." I tried to speak, but I couldn't get it out. "Breathe with me," he whispered, taking in a deep breath. I tried to take a deep breath in, but I couldn't, shaking my head and sobbing louder. The world felt like it was ending. I couldn't breathe. There was a psychopath in our house that had been shot 3 times and was still alive and kicking. "I know you can do it, baby, just take it slow. Let's try again, okay?" His voice was warm and sweet, and it had a soothing effect over me. He took another deep breath, and this time I took one in as well. My tears dried with every breath we took together. Remy smiled and pulled me into a hug, working effectively to calm me down more. After a minute, he pulled away, kissing me quickly before holding out his hand to me. I reached out my hand, interlacing our fingers together as I pulled myself up with his help. "I'm proud of you, love. You did such a good job." "Thank you, Remy. Anything for my woman." I wish I had just gone to a friend's house or to Adam's house, where Remy had been staying. None of this would be happening. The guilt crushed me even harder. Gil for bringing Remy into this mess. If hadn't called him, he wouldn't be here. He wouldn't have shot someone, worried about protecting me, about dying. The man was pacing back and forth down the hallway. We couldn't leave the room unless we wanted to come face to face with the intruder. He was banging on the walls and doors, laughing now and then. Nothing about this made sense. Remy had shot the man 3 times, and it only slowed him down for maybe a minute. It was dawning on us we would need to act quickly. Without being able to leave the room, there wasn't much for us to do. It was a waiting game. Remy walked over to the window, looking out briefly before trying to open it. Nothing. It wouldn't even budge. He let out a frustrated yell, punching the window. His chest heaved as his hand reared back, blood dripping from his knuckles. Remy, stop! I can't stand this. You're in danger and there's nothing I can do about it. He yelled. Remy, please. My voice shook as I spoke. No. He yelled, taking a step closer to me. I fuck. He yelled again. He took a few steps back again, his body snapping to the side as he punched the wall. I just stared at him. It was rare for Remy to act like this. The few times I'd seen him this mad was after hockey games that didn't go too well, which again was very rare. I wasn't sure what to do, honestly, there wasn't much for me to do. This could play one of 2 ways, his anger would either fuck us over or it would get us through this hell. I walked behind Remy, slipping my hand under his shirt and resting on his bare back. I could feel his muscles relax slightly at my touch. Remy, baby. I'm just as scared as you are, but we need to slow down and think. Slow down? We don't have time to slow down. His voice was still filled with frustration. If you keep lashing out like that, you are going to get both of us killed. He let out a sigh before, looking down at me. You're right, I'm sorry. He turned around, facing me, and I moved my hand on his bicep, giving it a soft squeeze. He placed a hand on my lower back as he let out another sigh, resting his forehead against mine. Our heads jerked to the door as a scratching sound came from the hallway. He was running his nails along them. It was a deep sound like he had claws. Remy, I don't think he's a human. The statement sounded stupid as it came out of my mouth, but it was the only plausible thing I could come up with. That's not possible, Jewel. No, but think about it. You shot him 3 times and it barely slowed him down. He's faster than normal people and he's fucking tall. And by the way, he looks, it's not human. For fuck's sake, Remington, he's taunting us right now. Remy ran a hand through his hair and began pacing back and forth as he stared down at the floor. He stopped in front of me, grabbing my arm and pulling me into him. His arms wrapped around me in a warm embrace. I melted into him, my head resting on his chest. His heart was beating fast and hard, almost like it would burst out of his chest. We stood there for a while, hugging each other, hoping this nightmare would end soon. My heart dropped as Remy let out a sob, his body shaking against mine. I looked up at him. He looked so sad, so broken. In the years that we had been together, I had never once seen him cry. I could feel tears well up in my own eyes as we looked at each other. Nothing was said. Nothing needed to be said. The look in his eyes gave everything away. He moved us to the bed, both of us sitting on the edge, facing the door. He held both of my hands in his, looking deep into my eyes. I need you to promise me something, Remy whispered somberly. Yes? If I die. Stop, I demanded. I couldn't believe what he was saying. We aren't doing this right now. He blinked at me before nodding his head. I love you, Julie, so much. I love you too, honey. There was a shattering sound from the hallway, causing me to jump onto Remy. He grabbed me, holding me close to him. It sounded like the man had knocked a picture off the wall. I jumped again as the man pounded on the door repeatedly. Just come out, I'm not going to hurt you. He screamed through the door. Remy's hand clamped over my mouth, knowing that I was most likely wanting to scream. The banging didn't stop, It went on for a few minutes before Remy placed me down on the bed and stood up. He pulled out the gun and aimed at the door. "Remy, what the fuck are you doing?" I hissed. He didn't answer, shooting twice. Through the door. The man yelled out in anger and pain. "Well, at least Remy hit the thing." "Motherfucker!" The man roared, his banging intensifying. I wasn't sure how much longer the door was going to hold the man back. He was far stronger than anyone else I had ever met. I ran to the bathroom that was connected to the guest room, turning on the light and shutting the door. I motioned for him to move and hide behind a desk that was placed to the side of the bedroom door. We stayed hidden there, as quiet as possible as we waited for the man to break through. It took him longer than I expected it to. It seemed like the bullets did cause some harm. The door opened, well, more like kicked down, and began searching the room. He laughed as he saw the bathroom light on. "So stupid," it muttered under its breath. Once the man made it to the bathroom door and began to kick the door in, I grabbed Remy's and ran out of the room. We ran down the hall, trying to get closer to the stairs when the man ran back out of the room. "There you are!" he exclaimed as he sprinted towards us. Remy fired 2 more shots, but the gun jammed at the 3rd shot. "Fuck," Remy muttered as he cleared the jam and fired the last 2 remaining bullets in the chamber. The man slowed briefly before charging us with a yell. We were so close to the stairs, but at the rate he was running, he would catch us before we could make it out the door. With no other choice, we were pushed into the last guest bedroom we had. Again, for the 3rd time tonight, we locked ourselves in this room. We waited and waited, but nothing ever came. It was silent. Too silent. There was a sudden running sound that went through the hallway and down the stairs. Was he leaving? We could hear the man start fumbling around downstairs. He was yelling and laughing as he destroyed everything he could. Glass shattered, furniture was thrown, drawers opened and slammed shut as the contents were being thrown around. He was toying with us. Everything Remy and I had built was being destroyed. I moved over to him. He was sitting on the edge of the bed with his head in his hands. I stood in front of him, between his legs, placing my hands on his face on each side of his face and lifted it gently. He was crying again. I leaned down forward and kissed his lips. He kissed me back, putting his hands on my waist and pulled me closer. I hugged him, his head resting on my chest as I played with his hair. If we were going to die tonight, I wanted this to be the last thing I remembered. The night trailed on for what felt like forever. We were exhausted and running out of ideas on what to do next. What if we try to make a break for it? I whispered. I don't know, Julie. I know it's not the smartest idea, but what else can we do? He broke the back door. All we'd have to do is get there and we'd be out of this hell. If anything were to happen to you, I don't know what I'd do. Remy, this might be the only chance we have. Okay, but stay close to me. I promise. We left the room silently and trudged closer to the top of the stairs. We stayed close to the wall for cover. My arm wrapped around his arm as moved, careful not to make any noise. The house was silent again as we edged the top of the stairs. I bit back a scream as we peered around the corner to see the man appear at the bottom of the stairs, a sickening smile on his face. He crept up the stairs as we moved back in response. He had something in his hand, but I couldn't tell what it was. Whatever it was, he threw it straight at us as he reached the midway point. Remy was prepared for it, somehow knowing that it was going to hit me. Remy's hand flew over my mouth too as I felt something pierce my side. Whatever it was tore straight through my skin and landed on the floor behind us. At first, all I felt was a wet, hot, sticky feeling. Blood. After a few seconds, it felt like a sharp, burning pain causing my side to be on fire. I let out a muffled scream as Remy's other arm came behind me and pressed onto the wound as hard as he could to stop the bleeding. My vision blurred and my breathing came in as gasps as the pain riddled my body. I cried as he pulled me into the nearest room, my back against his chest, my feet dragging. I had no clue how he had done it, but he somehow did it. he placed me down on the bed as he pulled his hand from my mouth. He kept his left hand on the wound as he spoke to me in a low whisper. I need you to stay as quiet as possible for me. This is really going to hurt, but I need to do this. All I could do was nod my head weakly in response as he pulled his hand from my side. I felt dizzy and like I was going to pass out and throw up all at the same time as he reached down and grabbed a t-shirt. In one swift movement, he tore the shirt into one long strip. He walked back to the bed and placed the torn shirt on the bed next to me before sitting down next to me. Hold on to my thigh, he whispered in my ear. He lifted my shirt and started stuffing the wound with the torn shirt. My eyes squeezed shut and my fingers dug into his thigh and I screamed again. The pain was blinding and my breath caught in my throat. After a minute I looked back up at Remy, who was grimacing. I could tell that Remy was struggling with causing me further pain, and damn, he looked like hell. His hair was disheveled, falling over his forehead and coated in sweat. He had a somber look on his face and the bags under his eyes looked even darker. His clothing had small tears in them and he had scratches and cuts on him, dried blood coating them. My blood covered his left hand up to his forearm, it was even under his fingernails. Regardless of the fact that the magazine was empty, Remy kept the gun tucked into his waistband. We were at a standstill, neither one of us knew what to do. The night felt never-ending, and I just wanted it to end. There was a loud thud in the hallway bringing us back to reality. A raging psychopath who couldn't die had somehow trapped us in our own home. There was a shuffling sound outside the door. He was right in front of the door. My eyes stayed locked on Remy, waiting to see what he was going to do. Remy looked defeated, like he was out of ideas on what to do. Who knows how long we stood there, just waiting for something to happen. Remy walked over to the dresser and began pulling it to the door, barricading it. He pulled the nightstand after, and as he was pulling the bed towards the doorknob jiggled. Remy stopped dead in his tracks and my eyes snapped to the door, but Remy quickly returned to moving the bed. It only took a few seconds for the banging to start. Remy moved back to grab something else when the intruder began to kick the door down. I jumped back, stumbling some when Remy grabbed me, stopping me from falling. He pulled me behind him in a protective stance before he spoke in a heartbreaking tone. I love you, Julie, he whispered, turning back to face me. I love you too, Remy, I whispered with tears running down my face at the realization that if not both, then one of us was about to die. He leaned down and placed his hand on my face and kissed me. I kissed him back, my hand wrapping around his wrist. After a few seconds, we pulled away. Remy gave me a soft smile, that gorgeous smile that I love dearly. I gave him a weak smile as the banging grew louder and louder, shifting the furniture that was against the door. Fight to the death, Remy whispered. I nodded in response and prepared myself as much as I could. With one last kick, the man sent the furniture flying, causing both of us to move in opposite directions. I groaned as a sharp pain radiated throughout my side from my quick movement. The man stood in the doorway, an evil smile on his face. His eyes were wide and wild, just staring at us before making his first move, laughing as he did so. I watched in horror as Remy charged the man, their bodies colliding violently. They both stumbled back before regaining their stances. Remy threw a punch, but the intruder was quicker, a sickening crunch echoing as his fist slammed into Remy's face. The impact sent Remy back a few steps, anger written all over his face. He stood up straight, throwing his arms out slightly and his hands turned to fists. He was going to fight for the both of us, and I knew he wouldn't stop until one of them was dead. Blood dripped from Remy's face and he looked feral. The man also followed suit and got ready to go again. Remy waited for the intruder to make the first move. The intruder lunged forward, arms outstretched, trying to tackle Remy. Remy dodged, digging his elbow into the man's back and pushing him to the ground. The man wrapped his hand around Remy's ankle and with a quick tug, they were both on the floor. The intruder was quickly on top of Remy, his hands placed around Remy's neck. Remy started to fight back, his hands clawing at the man's wrist. Remy was failing, the man was far too strong for him. Remy's face was red, and his movements were slowing. Without thinking, I jumped onto the man, who was strangling my fiancée. My body flew into his with an audible thud. My breath was not from me, and I took a deep gasp in. I pushed myself off the ground and stood tall. With my newfound confidence, I was prepared for whatever came my way. I could hear Remy shuffling, then felt him standing behind me. His breathing was heavy and labored, but ready to fight. The man laughed as he pushed himself off the floor, shaking invisible dust off of him, like he was a dog. The man charged us again, something glinting in his hand as he did. I moved out of the way, but Remy was too slow. He let out a yell as I turned around to see the man stabbing him. I screamed in horror as a squelching sound came when the man pulled out the knife and plunged it back into Remy. Another yell escaped Remy as he tried to fight the man off. Remy grabbed the man's wrist, in hopes of getting the man's hands off of the handle. Remy kicked his leg out, his foot colliding with the man's knee. The man fell to one knee, but before he could back up, Remy's knee was slamming under the man's chin. The man groaned and pushed back a few feet. Remy moved back, creating as much distance between him as he could. "What do you want from us?" Remy roared. "Nothing," the man responded. His answer was so cruel and evil. "Then, why are you doing this?" Remy questioned, his voice weak. "Because I can," the man said matter-of-factly. It was a horrifying realization that we had been going through all of this for no reason. All because the intruder could. This angered me, and I could tell from the growl that came from Remy that it had the same effect. I inched backward, moving away from Remy and the intruder. A blur blew past me, and I knew the man was going after Remy again. Remy let the man attack, but before the man hit Remy, he reached down and grabbed a piece of wood from the floor and plunged into the base of the intruder's neck. It hit them closer to the shoulder, but still affected him. He let out a howl, grabbing his neck and falling to his knees. Remy was on the man in a matter of seconds, his fist hitting every part of the man's body that he could. The man hardly moved, letting it happen. I have no idea how long Remy's assault on the man lasted. It felt like forever. Remy got off the man, now covered in blood. Mine, his, the intruder's, his breathing was heavy as he stood over the man. He crawled away from Remy, slowly but eventually, he stood up. "Fucking bitch," the intruder mumbled as he walked through the door of the room. We watched as the man limped out of the room, and heard him walk downstairs and out the front door. We made our way to the window. Remy had me tucked under his arm, and my arm was around the back of his waist. The sun was starting to rise, and as we peered out the window, a wolf was limping down the street. I looked up to Remy. He looked like shit. Bruises, blood, and sweat covered his face. There were deep purple hand marks around his neck from where he was almost strangled to death. He leaned down and kissed me. I kissed him back and wrapped my arms around him. "I love you, Julie." "I love you too, Remy." He smiled at me. We had survived. We still have no idea what we encountered that day. We were just happy to be alive. The police never found the guy, and I'm not sure they ever will. The whole ordeal lasted a little over 2 hours, but it felt like it was never going to end. It was the most horrifying night of my life. The following months were rough. We had to deal with the trauma and heal from the wounds. Remy was lucky that the man hadn't stabbed him anywhere vital. He was stabbed once, in the chest and once in the shoulder, and had a few broken ribs, and of course cuts and bruises. I had a couple of broken ribs, and luckily the wound in my side wasn't too bad. Turns out the man had thrown a large shard of glass and missed any organs. Recovery was a bitch. We only returned to the house 3 more times after that, to get anything that we wanted to take with us. We stayed with a friend for about a month before we moved about an hour away. We were both haunted by nightmares, and we still do occasionally. We were both diagnosed with PTSD but are going through therapy to help cope. This happened almost 2 years ago, and we are now happily married.